This week in
Win, 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 win. Yeah. Fuck everything else. Win, 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 win.
transfer season has kicked off. Sort of. With the Euros and Copa America both underway, most transfer activity will be delayed until the conclusion of those tournaments. But that hasn't stopped fans from reacting to the smallest shreds of news and making demands with regards not only to new signings, but with sales as well. And a lot of that commentary from the Arsenal fan base has been, well, deserving of some pushback. But this tweet and others are a reminder that many Arsenal fans have somewhat unrealistic expectations for how the club will fare offloading players this summer. So I'd like to use it as an opportunity to give perhaps a more realistic outlook. But first, let's discuss how Arsenal have done historically at selling. At the time of recording, Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain remains Arsenal's record sale 6 years on. Even worse, Nicolas Anelka's sale to Real Madrid is still Arsenal's second biggest sale a quarter of a century after the fact. And yes, the record sales of other teams in the Big Five are far more lucrative. But I want to note a few things in that regard. First, these record sales involved Real Madrid or Barcelona dropping big money on that club's best player at that time. Second, many of the club's other big departures took place within the last decade when they were earlier on in their cycles and clubs closer to winning came and took elite talent off them. In the time period during which Liverpool and Chelsea profited heavily in these sorts of situations, Arsenal first didn't have many sellable assets and now have done a good job of tying them down and keeping them at the club. With all that in mind, the overall picture isn't as damning. However, that doesn't mean Arsenal have been good at selling players, particularly during Arteta's tenure. Of Arsenal's most lucrative departures, the top 6 occurred under Arsene Wenger. This is despite the fact that early on in the Arteta era, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang and Mesut Ozil departed the club. But as we all know, they did so after having their contracts terminated. Even worse, Barcelona managed to turn a profit on Aubameyang 9 months after he left Arsenal. But both of these free transfers can be explained away as necessary evils. Both Aubameyang and Ozil threaten to undo the culture Arteta has worked steadfastly to establish at Arsenal. A few years on, it does seem worth it to have bitten the losses on those two players in order to keep the overall project moving in the right direction at a critical time. Arsenal do have one undeniable weakness when it comes to selling players, however, and that is letting go of players they're not entirely comfortable parting ways with. Which is unfortunate because the two biggest sales of Arteta's tenure and Arsenal's 7th and 8th biggest of all time came in those exact circumstances. And in hindsight, we were right to sell those players. Joe Willock joined Newcastle permanently after a successful loan spell there, and we haven't missed him. Folarin Balogun is now a Monaco player despite departing at a time when much of the fan base preferred to sell Eddie Nketiah, and he hasn't exactly set the world on fire there. So, it's disappointing to look back on missed opportunities like when Arsenal refused a £20 million bid from Wolves for Ainsley Maitland-Niles, who would eventually leave for free, or when they reportedly informed Aston Villa they wouldn't even accept £75 million for Emile Smith-Rowe, or even when the club reportedly rejected 3 different bids from Crystal Palace in one window, all for Eddie Nketiah. The fact is, Arsenal now house several players with whom they've kicked the can down the road for the last few years. But this summer, all of them, Nketiah, Smith-Rowe, Kieran Tierney, Sambi Lokonga, Nuno Tavares, and especially Reiss Nelson, whom David Ornstein reported is assessing his options to leave the club in this window, are prime candidates to leave the club. And several of these guys have long attracted interest from other clubs. For instance, Nketiah has been linked to Fulham, Crystal Palace, Brentford, West Ham, and Ipswich. Smith-Rowe has been admired by Aston Villa and West Ham. The likes of Brighton and AC Milan have reportedly been suitors for Nelson. Now, more than ever, Arsenal are in a position of strength when it comes to selling players. With the club being in high standing in Europe and having made record profits this season, they don't need to sell. That in turn gives them the bargaining power to dictate prices more than in previous windows. Additionally, most of the players they're likely to part ways with in the coming months are homegrown English players. One example of Arsenal understanding their new bargaining position in sales is this report from The Sun claiming that the Gunners aim to demand a total of £50 million for Ramsdale this summer. If true, it's a signal that the club intend to receive value for their players, even if they're out of favor at this point in time. It's also an example of how many Arsenal fans don't understand the basics of the negotiation process of a transfer. By reportedly demanding £50 million for Ramsdale, the club are engaging in anchoring, a common technique that involves creating an initial reference point to influence the other party's perception of value from the outset. It's essentially asking for more than you think you're going to get, but even Harvard studies have shown that it consistently works. However, there's another aspect of negotiations that are constantly at play here and will put a limit on how much Arsenal can get for their players, and that is BATNA, or Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. In the current financial landscape of English football, PSR appears to have hamstrung the spending powers of Premier League teams. So while there is plenty of reported interest in members of Arsenal's supporting ensemble, that interest only goes as far as the budget is willing to allow. Sure, Aaron Ramsdale is a great keeper, but why spend £50 million on him when you can have James Trafford for 20? Why sign Eddie Nketiah for £35 million or so when you can get Armando Broja for £30 million and lower wages? At the end of the day, Ramsdale is currently a much better keeper than Trafford. Nketiah is a much better striker than Broja. But for most PL clubs outside of the Big Five and Spurs, and the vast majority of European clubs, the prices we are reportedly quoting for our players are substantial. And there are many players out there in the same or comparable tiers, according to scouting departments of other clubs, who might be more attainable financially. So if our sales numbers depend on offloading players who are clearly surplus to requirements, Arsenal probably won't break that underwhelming departure record set by Oxlade-Chamberlain. Sure, they don't need to sell, and while guys like Nketiah, Ramsdale, and Smith Rowe are bench players, they're still bench players for one of the best teams in Europe. But they're not needle movers for teams that have the budget to drop big money on them. The difference between them and players like Ian Maatsen, an academy graduate Chelsea just sold to Aston Villa for about £40 million, is that Maatsen at 22 has spent the last 2 seasons helping Burnley get promoted to the Premier League and then serving as part of a Dortmund side that made this year's Champions League final. Smith Rowe, Nelson, and Nketiah, all older than Maatsen, have spent the last 2 years largely keeping the bench warm for the Gunners' key players. And that, effectively using loans to make our academy talents more valuable, is something else that we need to get better at too. So that means the players that are needle movers worthy of big fees are the likes of William Saliba, Martin Odegaard, and Bukayo Saka. And the only teams that can afford these players' likely valuations are either competing with us for silverware or unwilling to help us by giving us that much money. And that's getting past the small matter of us rightfully not wanting to sell them in a million billion years. Maybe someone will offer a surprising amount for Gabriel Jesus or Alexander Zinchenko. Maybe a Saudi club will come in and pay an exorbitant fee for Thomas Partey. But in all likelihood, unless Arsenal allow a shock exit by one of their best players, you really shouldn't expect a massive windfall in terms of player sales. Maybe Ramsdale or Nketiah will finally break our sales record, but it almost certainly won't be by much. So with all that being said, will Arsenal be better at selling this summer? I'd say yes. Sort of. They will be better at the things that lead to a better sales record, such as leveraging their stature and demanding value for players, and having enough of a ruthless streak to maybe offload bigger names they can do without, such as Zinchenko, reportedly. But given the introduction of PSR and the wealth gap between the Premier League and the rest of Europe, those improvements can only take Arsenal so far without them letting go of players they're uncomfortable letting go of. And the thing about transfers and the negotiations they involve is that it takes 2 to tango. But the last thing I want to address is this. I truly believe we need to change our thinking when it comes to what constitutes extracting value from a player. Arsenal Football Club are supposed to be in the business of winning. They're not supposed to be a venture capital firm for footballers. So why is it that the thinking always centers around the differential between what we paid for a player and what we sold them for? Imagine Arsenal receive an offer of £20 million for Leandro Trossard. If we sell for that amount after 30 goals and assists in a year and a half, multiple title races, and a quarterfinal appearance in the Champions League, isn't that pretty good value once you factor in the prize money, TV and matchday revenue, and increase in prestige from those results? To say, well, we lose £7 million on him if we sell for that amount, is to ignore the player's contributions to the health and standing of the club. So I believe there are calculations fans need to make when talking about whether we are getting value for a player. At the end of the day, Arsenal have work to do in order to get consistently good at sales. They need to do a better job improving and leveraging their youth talent through loans. They need to get more comfortable with frequent turnover of players who aren't impressing enough. But fans need to understand that negotiations are a two-way street, and that the way clubs define value likely differs from how they define it. And if Arsenal can improve in these facets, the way they've improved at preserving value through contract extensions and understanding the strengthened negotiating position their enhanced stature has brought them, then it will undeniably lead to bigger and better things.